I'm about 5 minutes away from the front door of my house and sitting in front of a genuine piece of the Berlin Wall. Why of all places should I be sitting in front of the Berlin Wall when this video is about Donald Trump? Well, stick around. This video is going to go in a lot of different directions, but it's all going to kind of come back in the end and hopefully make some sort of sense.
One does what God does enough times, it becomes God's. You put it together, you get what you wanted and desired enough times. He believes he will become one who is wanted and desired and accepted. Because God has power. And if one does what God does enough times, one will become as God is.
Yeah, we bringing you the hardcore, the real raw type shit. You ain't never seen nothing before like this.
Now, before diving into the actual substance of today's video, this is my granddad. This photo is taken in London in 1959. Here's another picture of my granddad stationed in Germany in 1953. And here's my granddad as a little kid. This is taken in India. My granddad was born and raised in India in a time when India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar was all British India. His father was actually born in the part of British India that's now called Pakistan. His daughter, my mother, was born and raised within a British community in Venezuela. I'm born in Australia, which was founded as a colony for British prisoners. And soon I will have my first child born here in Germany, which was under British occupation after the war. When I was a kid, there was a certain story that was told about Britain and its colonies.
Ngikulethele imikhonzo ephuma kubangani bakho amangisi.
Oh. Usibangani bethu abamhlophe lawa bakuphethe.
Bathi wena ubuswa ngomhlobo omdala ongalungile. Ukhule isethembiso ukuthi ngeke usababulala abantu bakho. Isho inkosikazi enkulu emhlophe ngeke babulala abantu ngababekanga icala. Yona ibusa amazwe angamashumi amane. Elidlula wonke usuku.
It takes a pretty fair conversation about the benefits of civilization and progress over tradition and uses it to divert attention away from the actual reasons for colonization. I'd like to just compare a couple of primary resources if I can. The first one is the first stanza of a poem written in 1899 by Rudyard Kipling. This poem is called The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new court sullen peoples, half devil and half child. The white man's burden itself is literally the calling to civilized people to tame the more savage corners of the earth. So that quote comes from 1899. This next quote comes from 1902, so around the same time, and this is from Lord Curzon, who at the time was Viceroy to India. So basically a kind of Prime Minister of India. Written in 1902, I quote, "To fight for the ultimate good of India may be a respectable sentiment, but we are not here for the purpose of indulging in that sentiment. We are here for the purpose of protecting and advancing our own interests." These two quotes are obviously in contrast with one another. One of them is idealistic, and the other one is very pragmatic. Yet they both point to the same end goal. To best understand that goal, we need to take a look at the origin of British India. Britain's influence in India began not with military intervention or with missionaries, but with a corporation. One of the world's first corporations, to be exact. That was the East India Company. The significance of the corporation as a concept is all in the name. The word corpus comes from the Latin for body, and a corporation is legally an agent, just like you or me. It can hire people, fire people, get rich, go bankrupt, and take political office, all of which the East Company did in its lifetime. Now, a feature of corporations is that they are owned by other agents. These can be both people and other corporations. If you own a share in a corporation, You get to benefit from the profits generated by that corporation, but unlike other assets, like a slave or a horse or a car, if the corporation fails and generates debt, investors are never liable for more than their original investment. This concept is called limited liability, and it made corporations very attractive to investors. For this reason, the East India Company became one of the most powerful legal entities of all time. But here's the problem. Unlike powerful humans like kings and priests who have to balance motivators like fear, desire, and a conscience, corporations are motivated by just one goal: to maximize profit for shareholders. That's it. So can we really make the argument that colonization was done for the benefit of the colonized? Personally, I don't think so. You see, colonization has always been about resources. When the British returned India to the Indian people, were they restoring Indian culture back to its indigenous state? Far from it. Before the British arrived in India, India had been occupied by the Mughals. This comes from a Persian word for Mongol, and the Mughals themselves trace their lineage back to Genghis Khan, though I'm sure most Mongol invaders trace their lineage back to Genghis Khan. Before the Mughals, India was occupied by Turks, during which period India was known as the Delhi Sultanate. Before Turks, India was occupied by Arabs, and way back in prehistory, it's understood that the Indo-Europeans, with whom we share a common root language called Proto-Indo-European, were invaders in India, which was inhabited by a perhaps indigenous population, but that far back in history, it's pretty hard to tell. When it comes to colonization, it might be turtles all the way down. What I'm getting at here is that there's nothing unusual about colonization. If you think about it, it's kind of the most ordinary thing that people can do. Sure, you could go into a country and take their resources if the resources are things you can just stick in a bag and take home. But what if the resources lie deep under the ground? What if you're looking for treasures like oil and gold? Then you need to build infrastructure. Maybe you also need manual labor. You don't want to pay the people from your country who are already overpaid and greedy. You want to use the local labor who you can underpay and overwork. For all the British talk of ethics and spreading civilization and the white man's burden in the post-colonial era, I would say this: you don't need to send ethics to solve a problem which can be explained by economics. With all of that said, let's talk about Donald Trump.
What would you do differently with respect to Libya, to the Middle East right now?
Well, first of all, the rebels, nobody knows who the rebels are, so you have to be very careful. And if you're doing it on the humanitarian, he should have done it 2 or 3 weeks earlier, because a lot of people died during that 2 weeks while they were trying to make up their minds as to what to do. But the big problem, frankly, with the Gaddafi thing is, who are the rebels? I hear they're tied to Iran. I hear they're tied to Al-Qaeda.
I guess I'm saying would you intervene in that situation or not if you were President Obama?
I'd have to find out who the rebels were. But I'll tell you what, I'm only interested in Libya if we take the oil. If we don't take the oil, I have no interest in Libya.
I guess I'm not the only person who thinks that he's gone way off script here, right? You can almost see the guy standing off camera with the clipboard and headphones going, yeah. It's 2016. And that's not why we invade countries. We only invade countries to spread democracy, or prevent injustice, or to quell the spread of communism. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to talk about an American empire. And usually I'm not a big fan of abstractions like this. The United States is, after all, a republic. How could I balance the kind of authoritarianism that's implied by an empire with the signs of democracy that we obviously see playing out? This November, there will be elections in the United States. Well, if you're a US citizen, let me ask you this. If you want to see a decrease in military spending this November, which party do you vote for? Both parties advocate for an increased military budget, and without a preferential voting system, a third party is the same as throwing your vote away. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. I think America's great, and I think American people are great, and I don't think that your country is authoritarian. What I'm saying is that the world is shades of gray. And as long as I'm accusing the United States of being an empire, I think it's really important that I ask the question, what is an emperor? According to the thinker who I reference probably too often on this channel, Yuval Noah Harari, an emperor exists in 3 states. There's the objective emperor, a flesh and blood person, just like you or me. There's the subjective emperor, who is merely a projection in the minds of other people. This is ephemeral and changes from person to person. The third state in which the emperor exists, the third state of reality, as Harari puts it, is the most important in this context. This is the intersubjective. This is where my subjective interpretation of the emperor and your subjective interpretation of the emperor overlap, and we find a common story. Intersubjective reality binds people together with a network of stories and is the basis for tribes that grow into the millions. We're talking about religions, nations, and economies. So here, I have an Australian $5 note. And look, it even has a picture of the Queen. This $5 note also exists in three states of reality. There's an objective note. It's made of plastic. It's printed in kind of fluorescent colors. It has no real objective value at all. This note also has subjective value. How do I feel when I look at money? Maybe I reject it. Maybe I hate the concept of money. Maybe it means a lot to me. This could change depending on what part of the world I live in, but it's specific to each person individually. That's subjective reality. This third layer of reality, the intersubjective reality, is the layer where I can take this $5 Australian note and I can exchange it for a certain value in euro. Currently, the exchange rate is €3.08, and this will be honored no matter where I am in the world. That is the power of intersubjective reality. The intersubjective realm is the one where the concept of a nation or an emperor or indeed a messiah has power. The objective reality of these concepts doesn't really matter at all. That's why it's okay that Germans worship a German Jesus and Koreans worship a Korean Jesus. Remember the corporation, a legal agent without a body? Well, I think in the case of the USA, we need to imagine a crown without a king. Instead, much like the corporation, what we have in its place is what Dwight Eisenhower referred to as the complex, a network of corporate and political interests with its own emergent motivation. What motivates the empire? Altruism, right? Wrong. But it's still kind of complicated. That's why I made a video about it. Ask yourself the question of what motivates your behavior. Maybe you're a pleasure-seeking hedonist, in which case we would say that your motivations are selfish, or maybe you're motivated by responsibilities to your family and your community, in which case we would say that your motivations are altruistic. The important thing to remember is that you are a system that is complicated but ultimately deterministic. In that sense, you're merely following chemical outputs released by your brain. Those outputs are triggered by inputs, and the inputs that you seek out are pre-selected by your genes. On some level, you can only ever and will only ever do what you want to do. And in this sense, selfish and altruistic are merely subcategories of this universal human condition. So what motivates the empire? What motivates anyone other than self-interest? Now, part of the social contract that we find ourselves in is that the American story can go to war against the Soviet story or the fascist story. The consequences of these wars will be real, but we accept those consequences when we're fighting in the name of our binding mythology. Of course, none of this changes the fact that wars are still actually fought for our own enrichment, but the social contract still holds as long as nobody says that out loud. Well, saying this out loud is what Donald Trump, maniac that he is, has just done. However you feel about Trump is probably going to determine how you interpret this moment. He's either willfully torn the delicate fabric of civil discourse and set us back centuries in terms of our ability to communicate effectively, or he's just said the first honest thing to come out of a politician's mouth, probably since the Second World War. And we're back to the wall. The one thing that I hope to never be on this channel is naive. I hope there's no confusion from my side that from where I stand, if you are lucky enough, historically speaking, to live under the umbrella of one of these empires, life is infinitely better than if you're on the outside. I'm aware of how that sounds, and it's not great. Try telling someone in the Marshall Islands who had nuclear weapons tested on their family that living under the umbrella of the American empire is a net positive for their life. Try telling the same to an Indigenous Australian who had their children forcibly removed by the British. Try telling the same to anyone from mainland Europe with Celtic ancestry. You can't. They're all dead. So I know it's terrible to say. However, it does still stand to reason that in the long arc of history, if you are born under the protection of an empire, chances are you're living a longer and more prosperous life than if you weren't. It's a fact that applies almost across all cultures and across all history that the highest value held by humans in any society is the value of life itself. If the empire can provide you not just a longer life, but a higher chance of survival for your children, well then from that perspective, it does become a bit easier to justify imperial ambitions, does it not? If the only argument that you can wield against this is one of sovereignty, well then, I'm sorry, you've just brought sovereignty to a conversation about life and death. But I want to give sovereignty the discussion it deserves. I by no means want to diminish the crime of taking away a group of people's right to self-determination. Can we make the argument that a culture is equal in value to a human life? The story of Australia's stolen generation is the story of a loss of culture. And the echo of that tragedy is still felt far more deeply than the vast majority of human lives that have been lost throughout history. So yes, perhaps the stealing of sovereignty is a crime akin to the murder of an individual. But now we've found ourselves once again swamped by the original misconception around empires. The empire doesn't want your sovereignty. It wants your stuff. It's well understood that part of the success of the Roman Empire was its tolerance and leniency towards the religions and cultures of its subjects. From the perspective of a Persian god king, Rome is no empire. How could it be when the people don't live in constant fear of their emperor? The British example shows a further decentralization of the imperial model. From a Roman perspective, the British Empire looks more like a network of influence and allies, but to the Romans, that also is no empire. And now we arrive in the 21st century, and the American Empire is surely the most benevolent world authority you could possibly imagine. The American Empire says keep your religion, maintain your customs, keep your flag and your community leaders. While you're at it, benefit from our protection. Join us in a culture of free trade. Let us share knowledge and walk together into a free and enlightened tomorrow. But we're taking your oil.
Be still and know your underlying soul.